And if the United States reduced its military significantly, the path would be made smooth to reduce it entirely. That is, without losing faith in militarism, the United States could limit its so-called Defense Department to things that serve a defensive purpose. It could guard its borders with all kinds of weaponry. But doing just that, and closing the foreign bases and occupations, scrapping the aircraft carriers and submarines, dismantling the nuclear weapons, abandoning all work on weapons in space would have some major results. Without the U.S. threat and arms supply, arms races could reverse. Korea could reunite. Palestine could potentially reach a one-state solution. Without U.S. troops kicking in doors, policing the globe, the U.S. government, the primary holdout, would be able to support international law. Most importantly, perhaps, any significant fraction of $2 trillion has the power to transform the world for the better, if put to proper use. Gone would be starvation, gone would be unclean water, or lack of water in Detroit, gone homelessness. These are problems that end with the proper use of a tiny fraction of $2 trillion a year. Imagine if, in 2003, the United States had simply given each citizen of Iraq $250,000. That expense would not approach what's actually been spent, but I'm willing to bet that at least some Iraqis would have appreciated the act. Of course, giving away money is not simple, and there are more effective ways to invest in health and education and green energy than just handing out cash. The point is, we spent more money than that, and what did we get? Over 1 million killed, millions injured, millions traumatized, a nation destroyed, the natural environment severely damaged, our economy drained, our civil liberties eroded, our culture corroded, our morality poisoned, and most of the world viewing the United States as a threat. For a smaller expense, the U.S. government could be loved. It chooses to spend more and to be hated. When Gallup polled 65 nations at the end of 2013 and asked what nation is the greatest threat to peace in the world, the overwhelming winner was the United States. By the way, do you know who won in the United States? A nation that spends less than 1% what the United States does on war. Iran. I recommend pointing that poll out to people. It seems to me you either have to declare the world severely and irrationally deluded, perhaps requiring yet more militarism, or you have to begin opening your eyes to the failure of militarism on its own terms, at which point you can notice that the United States loses all of its land wars, exacerbates whatever it claims to be fixing with its air wars, and plants seeds of evil with its drone wars. And countless recently retired U.S. officials admit to all of this. Our neighbors up in Canada are trying to follow our warlike path, and I've been trying to tell them that they will regret it, but that it will take them years of work to build up anti-Canadian terrorist groups that rival those the United States has generated. So-called defense spending is counterproductive, but it's not for amateurs. To have each new militant group in the Middle East using your weapons and imitating your rhetoric while releasing full-length films begging you to attack it, and then growing by leaps and bounds when you do attack it, so that even your own citizens with some FBI prodding want to join in, and the media can start pretending that the foreign group has infiltrated your cities. All of this takes skill that the United States has been mastering since before it stopped invading Canada. Did you see this headline, ISIS in Brooklyn? Of course, no one from Iraq or Syria had come to Brooklyn to work for ISIS or even contacted anyone in Brooklyn. Rather, someone in Brooklyn had been poked and prodded into something by an FBI agent pretending to be ISIS. The U.S. began in Yemen with murder by missile, and drone defenders would come up to you and tell you that missiles are better than other kinds of war, because with drones, nobody dies, meaning no Americans. A year ago, President Obama was claiming some sort of success in Yemen. Several years ago, even I, who could not predict the basketball Final Four worth a darn, predicted that drone war on Yemen would create a U.S. assisting Saudi Arabia in slaughtering children to blow up U.S.-supplied weapons using U.S.-supplied weapons. And we get to sit back and think of those Yemenis as backward, violent beasts because of their human nature, which justifies our Pentagon, which created this disaster. Did you know there was a big protest in the Czech Republic recently of the U.S. militarism directed at Russia, and one in Kiev? On Hitler's upcoming birthday, April 20th, the United States will start training Ukraine's neo-Nazi volunteer military force. The United States has troops and weapons in Ukraine and throughout Eastern Europe now, right up to the border of Russia. People take this sort of thing a bit seriously while we watch our basketball. The U.S. lied to Russia when the two Germanys reunited, claiming that NATO would not expand an inch eastward. The U.S. facilitated a coup in Ukraine and is building up hostilities there, and Europeans and Russians are outraged. Last July 4th, I spoke outside a U.S. military base in England where the locals celebrate an Independence from America holiday. I've been talking with protesters this week in Sicily who are resisting construction of a U.S. Navy communications base in the desert in Sicily. On Jeju Island, South Korea, resistance to a new U.S. Navy base is intense. In Okinawa, the local government has now heeded the protesters and halted U.S. base construction against the will of the Japanese government. The Philippines is in an uproar over U.S. military action there. Around the world, people know the United States through its military occupation of their land. And I watch basketball, and the announcer thanks the U.S. troops for watching from 175 countries, as if that's good and normal. Some know that it isn't. I applaud Pax Christi for speaking against the idea of a just war. Once we rid ourselves of the idea that some wars are good wars, we ought to be able to rid ourselves of the idea that we should be funding the permanent presence of either troops or robot death planes in darn near every country on Earth. One doesn't generally hear about cases of just child abuse, or just rape, or just racial discrimination. The Washington Post recently ran a column headlined, "War on Iran might be our best option." Imagine if it had said, "Racism may be our best option," or "Killing kittens may be our best option." Some things are quite rightly unacceptable. What if war were made one of those? This is the case that we're making at World Beyond War. There is no upside to war, no excuse for war. It is all negative, and it is the most negative thing that we do, the most evil institution on Earth, and there is no way to fix it. Human Rights Watch recently wrote a report on the horrors inflicted on Iraqi towns, not by ISIS, but by the Iraqi militias said to be liberating people from ISIS. But rather than acknowledging that such horrors have been part of every single war ever waged, Human Rights Watch urges reform plans and benchmarks and compliance with the so-called laws of war. Amnesty International just came out with a report on the 2014 assault on Gaza that condemns the rockets shot out of Gaza for being insufficiently precise, as if better US-made rockets would be more legal and acceptable. You cannot, the UN is planning another meeting on inhumane weapons. Which ones are the humane weapons? You cannot use laws to reform the greatest violation of law. You cannot reform an institution of mass killing. Imagine trying to reform cancer. Studies have actually found that talking about a so-called war on cancer hurts the cause of reducing cancer because people don't adjust their behavior to avoid risks, focusing instead on medical hopes to destroy cancer and eliminate it from the world. But at least the understanding is there that cancer is entirely undesirable, that we don't need Geneva Conventions for the proper creation and use of good cancer. A remarkable article appeared in the June 2014 issue of the American Journal of Public Health. I quote, "Since the end of World War II, there have been 248 armed conflicts in 153 locations around the world. The United States launched 201 overseas military operations between the the end of World War II and 2001, and since then others, including Afghanistan and Iraq. During the 20th century, 190 million deaths could be directly and indirectly related to war, more than in the previous 4 centuries. End quote. Beyond death, beyond the death, war injures and traumatizes on a far vaster scale. It is the leading cause of homelessness. It is by various measures the leading destroyer of the natural environment. It is by far the leading justification for the erosion of civil liberties and self-governance. It is the leading drain on wealth and prosperity in the world. Imagine if such an institution were newly proposed. Wouldn't we immediately reject it out of hand? It was wonderful to see pushback when Indiana proposed to allow discrimination against people based on their sexual orientation. Imagine if Indiana proposed the creation of the institution of war. I mean, imagine if we didn't have war, and Indiana came up with the idea. We'll dump over half of government spending into this new operation Indiana will propose, and it won't do us any good, but it will put our lives at risk while murdering thousands upon thousands of innocent people, and we'll lose a lot of rights in the process. Who would stand for such an outrage? But then why should something be acceptable just because it already existed yesterday? Shouldn't we bloody well be outraged? Isn't there an appropriate anger here? Might there not even be a place, at least generically, for the term weenie heads? What if, instead of Indiana, it was a foreign country that did some of the things the United States does? When Ecuador said the United States could keep its bases there if Ecuador could have a base in Florida, the idea seemed ludicrous. Why? When Iran tries to keep U.S. ships a bit further from its coast, the U.S. calls this aggression. But how close would the U.S. like Iranian ships to be to its coast? If Mexico were murdering people with drones in the United States, would U.S. lawyers approve? If Cuba bombed Miami for harboring terrorists, would U.S. State Department lawyers defend that action? This is always a good test of morality, sometimes known as the golden rule, but also in this case a good test for nationalism. One way to test whether you're identifying with a nation is to ask yourself if you would approve of the same actions if performed by a different nation. You can't identify with a nation but want it to behave fairly toward other nations, but only if you are identifying more so with humanity. Another way for people to question their beliefs is to ask how you would feel if the so-called collateral damage, that is to say, the bulk of the people killed in a war, the innocent civilians, were in the United States. Could you justify it as a price worth paying for whatever it is that supposedly it's a price worth paying for? Most people clearly could not, but do not ask the question, and do not let themselves even know that the wars are one-sided slaughters of people from dispensable nations, rather than from the indispensable one. Another good test is to ask yourself what you would approve if another political party did it. If a Republican president were going through a list of men, women, and children on Tuesdays and picking which ones to murder, would you react in exactly the same way in which you have reacted to President Obama's kill list? This question begins with the question of whether you would allow yourself to know about a story that has been public knowledge for 3 years since a front-page New York Times article covered it, or would you avoid knowing about this outrage? Secondary is the question of what you would do if you allowed yourself to know. A similar question is what you would think if a different branch of government did something. If the House Armed Services Committee were going through a kill list, picking victims and murdering them and anybody nearby them, would you approve or dissent or ask for details? In the case of the one war that President Obama does not want with Iran, people have suddenly discovered that they can advocate for alternatives to war. Another good question to put into people's minds is this: why not prefer alternatives to war in the case of each of the other wars being waged or contemplated? Why only Iran? Why object to the rush to war only when one U.S. political party does so? Why object to gruesome executions by ISIS and not by Saudi Arabia? Why get outraged on command rather than everywhere events are outrageous. I think we need to ask these sorts of questions and get organized to work for a stronger push to eliminate war and replace it with nonviolent means of resolving conflicts, because contrary to certain Western academic pretenses, war is not going away, much less going away on its own. On the contrary, war is worsening its destruction, and the use of drones is normalizing war in a way that makes greater and greater destruction likely. I've drafted some remarks for later today in which I look at how we might get to a world beyond war and what a world beyond war might look like. I think properly understanding a world devoted to war is the only place to start. And I think we should understand it not as an entire world hopelessly condemned to war, but as a world making completely optional decisions to proliferate war primarily at the insistence of the United States government. Understanding that war is a choice means that peace, too, is an available option. I had planned to leave time here for questions, but learned that there is a whole separate section on the schedule for questions. So let me instead begin the topic of what do we do about it? How do you get enough people sufficiently active to push back against war and militarism? Well, we had enough people active from 2001 to 2007 to spread a great deal of at least short-lived awareness of at least some of the evils of war, and to force an end, temporary as it turned out, to the U.S. war on Iraq, albeit on a 3-year delay. And we had enough people informed and active in 2013 to prevent a massive assault on Syria that Wall Street, the corporate media, and the top politicians in Washington all favored and expected to begin imminently. But by 2014, President Obama, who had been forced out of Iraq by Bush's treaty, was right back in, and the U.S. was engaged in the same war it had failed to fully join in 2013, albeit on the opposite side. Yet in 2015, publicly supported diplomacy with Iran was holding off the neocon vision of a war there. What makes the difference between moments when peace succeeds and moments when war does? Well, it helps when other interests align. Obama wants peace with Iran, but Iranian war along with U.S. war against ISIS. The reason peace only succeeds for a moment, though, is that peace doesn't advance beyond a pause for reloading. The U.S. didn't bomb Syria 2 years ago, but it didn't invest in aid, diplomacy, or an arms embargo either. Instead, it armed and trained killers, bided its time, and waited for better propaganda. The propaganda that seems to do best is not that of humanitarian war, but that of a war against evil demons coming to get us. ISIS throat slitters bringing Ebola from Mexico to our children's schools. These were real headlines. What makes the difference in terms of public engagement in the United States at the moment, and we had better change this or it will kill us all, is partisanship. A couple of scholars, Michael Heaney and Fabio Rojas, have a new book out called Party in the Streets, the Anti-War Movement and the Democratic Party after 9/11. Some of you may have run into them as they surveyed participants in peace events for years and years. They found that identification of the Democratic Party with peace was the primary factor in enlarging the peace movement toward the beginning of the Bush presidency and in shrinking it toward the end of the Bush presidency. So the obvious answer as to how you enlarge the peace movement is not really a secret at all. You install a Republican president. Now, you can debate whether the cure is worse than the disease, but the cure is as certain as Advil for a headache. You want a bigger peace movement? Swallow a Republican president and a Republican vice president and see how things look in the morning. Now, determining whether Republican presidents are worse war makers, even with activist resistance, is not so simple and not actually going to help us. Unless we build a peace movement larger and more principled than alliance with either big political party will allow, we're done for. The top risk from war is nuclear holocaust. That danger continues to grow with active U.S. assistance. The second worst thing a U.S. president can do about war is grab more war powers and pass them on to all the future presidents. In that regard, President Obama has outdone President Bush. Lying to Congress is now totally routine. Congress and the United Nations can simply be ignored. Secrecy has mushroomed. President Obama picks out men, women, and children to kill on Tuesdays. The public, the Congress, and the courts have no say and often no knowledge. President Obama has dramatically increased U.S. weapons sales abroad, the U.S. being far and away the top supplier of weapons to regions that the U.S. public thinks of as inherently violent. But while Obama's body count does not yet begin to approach Bush's in terms of people directly and violently killed, that is not a standard that will get us to survival, much less peace and prosperity. We should not, of course, think of the political party that lied the United States into 2 world wars, the Korean War, the war on Vietnam, the Kosovo War, the Libya War, and the war on ISIS, the party that dropped the nukes on Japan as a party for peace. Long-time war advocates like Charles Schumer and Hillary Clinton should not get a pass. Hillary was instrumental in persuading her husband to bomb the former Yugoslavia against the will of Congress. She pushed for the 2003 attack on Iraq and the 2011 attack on Libya. She tried to get a U.S. war on Syria going in 2013. She pushed for the Obama-era escalation in Afghanistan, a war that is now more Obama's than Bush's by every measure. Hillary Clinton has urged Iran to be aware that she could obliterate it. She has giggled with pleasure at having killed Muammar Gaddafi. She is hawkish on Ukraine. But the sort of candidate the Republicans will nominate will be just as bad. The answer to a broken electoral system begins with ceasing to look for new messiahs through elections. Imagine that the world survives to 2024, and the Democrats are dedicated to electing a Latino, perhaps warmonger, or perhaps even a gay warmonger, valuing tokenism over human life. I don't think such a world would last to 2026. But Democratic Party-style opposition to a Republican president will not save us either. Opposing the war on Iraq because of the 3% of the deaths that were Americans, or because of the fraction of the financial damage that was American, left people ill-informed and ill-prepared to oppose other wars. Opposing the war on Iraq because the war on Afghanistan was more important was not a way to end war. Opposing the war on Iraq because it drained military preparedness was a way to elect a new regime intent on enlarging the military and preparing for more wars. Opposing Pentagon corruption and wasting money on weapons that don't even work is not the way to oppose war. I love the weapons that don't even work when compared with the alternative. What should give us some inspiration is the public resistance in 2013 to the so-called missile strikes into Syria, because the support for it was bipartisan or nonpartisan, and the opposition nonpartisan. That opposition is what we can build on, but it needed to be far stronger to make its momentary success last. It needed to undo the phony debate between bombing and doing nothing. It needed to make clear the alternatives of diplomacy, ceasefires, arms embargoes, negotiations, aid, peace workers, human shields, journalists, and video cameras, rather than weapons and trainers and war planners and that horror of an embarrassment known as the CIA. So we need a bigger, better peace movement, and we need an ally with other movements, including one to create open, free, and verifiable elections. And I'll talk about that in my second speech. But just before I close, would you like to hear my paranoid suspicion as to why my first shipment of books arrived here as an empty box? I think I annoyed the CIA. There was a trial of Jeffrey Sterling. Raise your hand if you know about Jeffrey Sterling. Ought to be, if any of these whistleblowers from Edward Snowden to Brad McMahon and all the rest of them are heroes, Jeffrey Sterling is a hero, but he was never demonized in the media, so we never could flip that around and call him a hero. Jeffrey Sterling was a CIA handler of a former Russian used by the CIA to slip nuclear bomb plans to Iran in the year 2000. The plans had mistakes inserted into them, which was supposed to slow down Iran's non-existent nuclear bomb program, except that the mistakes were glaringly obvious to the Russian, among others. So Sterling went to Congress with this information, and Congress did nothing. So somebody went to a New York Times reporter named James Risen. Raise your hand if you've heard of James Risen. You may not have noticed, but almost none of the articles about James Risen mentioned what it was that he made public. Ought to have been relevant to him being prosecuted for, or threatened with prison for making something public. Well, somebody went to James Risen with this story of the CIA giving nuclear bomb plans to Iran. And the New York Times would do nothing with it. So James Risen published it in a book. And now they have convicted Jeffrey Sterling of giving secret information to James Risen based on what the NSA calls metadata and says you need not worry anything about. That is, they know that Sterling and Risen spoke on the phone, but they have no idea what was said. Many other people could have told Risen, including the congressional staffers. And it was a secret that was a secret not to protect you and me, but to protect the conniving meatheads at the CIA. Now, in the course of the trial, the CIA made a document public with certain words blacked out. It was a report on plans in 2000 to give nuclear bomb plans to another country. Well, I wrote about this document and I pointed out that the other country was Iraq. That not long before the big Iraq mushroom cloud scare of 2002, the CIA had been at least planning to give nuclear bomb plans to Iraq. Whether they did or not, we don't know. There were two clues, which frankly Encyclopedia Brown could have found quite easily, that made the blacked out country in the CIA report Iraq. First of all, it was preceded by the article "and," not "a," meaning that it began with a vowel. Second, the document was written on a grid, with the characters lining up in vertical columns as well as horizontal lines of text, so it was obvious exactly how many letters had been blacked out. Only Iraq or Oman would work, and Oman made no sense at all. Now, my goal is not to annoy the CIA, but to encourage those working at the CIA to quit, and those funding the CIA to cut it off, and those tolerating the CIA as a secret war-making machine to at least imagine how they would feel about that if the president were a Republican. Thanks for being here.